Toji Fushiguro has one of the most tragic character arcs in all of Jujutsu Kaisen, starting out as an outcast because he lacked cursed energy and only being useful as a father after he died and was reincarnated. In today's video, I'll be exploring what would happen if Toji was reborn with his memories. Before we dive in, let's do a quick recap, because Toji's backstory is everything here. Toji was born into the Zenin clan, one of the three great sorcerer families, but with the tremendous drawback of having absolutely zero cursed energy. Among the great sorcerer families, your worth is measured by the strength of your cursed techniques, and lacking one made Toji an outcast. But the Zenin clan didn't just ignore him, they would throw him into a pit filled with second-grade cursed spirits as a form of punishment and torture. But Toji wasn't just any regular human. He had a heavenly restriction that traded away all his cursed energy for a physical body that operates on a completely different level. He had strength, speed, and instincts that went far beyond what most sorcerers can perceive, and even the sorcerers who could follow his movements struggled to counter them. Toji learned to fight using cursed tools, and together with the physical abilities granted by his heavenly restriction, that put him on the same level as a special grade sorcerer. Eventually, Toji left the Zenin family and became a bounty hunter. He was commissioned to kill sorcerers, and when it came to his targets, Toji had no allegiances. He was just fulfilling contracts. The money he earned from bounty hunting went towards gambling and purchasing even more expensive and powerful cursed tools, such as the inverted spear of heaven that he became known for. But somewhere along the way, Toji was tamed, and he married Megumi's mother. For a brief window, Toji found peace, raised 2 kids, and actually let himself be human. But then she died, and this was all it took to send Toji back to his old ways. He went back to gambling and fighting, becoming exactly the man the Zenin clan always assumed he was. He even sold Megumi to the Zenin clan, using the excuse that Megumi's cursed energy was worth something, and that the Zenin could give him a future that Toji couldn't. The first instance where Toji makes a difference in the canon timeline is when he takes on the contract to execute the star plasma vessel Riko Amanai. This incident sets up the entire future of Jujutsu society, because it triggers Geto's disillusionment with human society, turning him into a curse user who wishes to eliminate all humans without cursed energy. Being nearly killed by Toji also led to Gojo's awakening, where he figured out how to use reverse curse technique and hollow purple on the brink of death. But most importantly, eliminating the star plasma vessel meant that Tengen was unable to assimilate with a human, forcing them to evolve. This meant that Tengen became something closer to a curse spirit than a human, and as a result, was vulnerable to curse spirit manipulation. All of these factors were key elements of Kenjaku's plan to initiate the culling game, and there's no telling what would have happened if not for Toji's involvement. But Toji didn't know any of this, and he was killed by the newly awakened Gojo, and he only returns to the mortal plane years later, after he gets puppeteered back to life through Granny Ogami's seance technique. During the battle in Shibuya, Toji goes out hunting the strongest beings around him, killing Dagon and then turning to Megumi. But when he realizes that Megumi is his son and still goes by the name Fushiguro, Toji decides to kill himself to save his child's life. And this is where our story begins, because thanks to the seance technique, Toji's body and soul have been corrupted with cursed energy. This forces his soul back in time to the point where he began interacting directly with Jujutsu society, the day he left the Zenin clan. Toji doesn't gain any new powers, but he holds the memories of everything he's experienced, including the incidents in Shibuya. So what does a man like Toji Fushiguro do when he knows exactly where every road leads? There are 2 paths Toji can take here, depending on how much he's willing to change. In our first timeline, Toji makes a choice he could never make the first time around. He stops. He's no longer young and angry. He comes to terms with all the scars the Zenin clan carved into him. Toji still meets Megumi's mother, but when the relationship deepens, he doesn't keep one foot out the door. He stays and commits to her, allowing himself to be loved for once. But there are some things in the past that you simply cannot change. And despite Toji's best efforts, his wife still falls ill and eventually passes away. But this time, Toji doesn't disappear into gambling dens to avoid the weight of it. He decides that Megumi and Sumiki don't deserve to lose their father as well, and stays home with them. His life spent as a sorcerer killer comes to an end, because without an expensive gambling addiction, he has the financial capability to support his children. During this time, Toji actually engages with Megumi's development as a sorcerer. He knows 10 Shadows technique is extraordinary and doesn't need the Zenin clan to be the authority on whether Megumi's curse technique is valuable. Remember, Toji doesn't know the events of Shibuya or the culling game, so he doesn't realize that Megumi will eventually end up being the head of the Zenin family. Instead, he believes that Megumi will be forced to bow down to the likes of Naoya Zenin, so he tries to introduce Megumi into Jujutsu society under the Fushiguro family name. Megumi still ends up at Jujutsu High, but this time he's not clueless about the world of Jujutsu sorcery. He goes in with a father who knows the landscape, and Toji can even quietly call in favors with people he encountered across years of doing dirty work. Toji's underworld connections don't just disappear because he stopped taking contracts, and if anything, a retired Toji might be more useful as an information broker. But I know what you're thinking now. What happened to the Riko Amanai contract? In the original timeline, Toji takes the job from the Time Vessel Association, a cult that worships Master Tengen but also opposes Riko's merger with him. Their logic is that if Tengen merges with the Star Plasma Vessel, Tengen resets and remains a neutral existence. If the merger doesn't happen, Tengen continues to evolve, potentially into something they they can worship as a true god rather than a maintained system. This time, Toji doesn't take the contract as he doesn't want to endanger his kids or risk his life against Gojo Satoru. But then what happens to Riko Amanai? The Time Vessel Association doesn't just give up and they find another assassin. But the real question is whether that assassin will be as strong as Toji Fushiguro. The entire reason the original plan worked was because Toji's heavenly restriction made him invisible to cursed energy detection, and by extension, to Gojo's 6 eyes. He was the only person in the world who could reliably get close enough to threaten someone of Gojo's caliber before his full awakening. Without Toji, Gojo and Geto escort Riko successfully, leading to the point where she decides if she wants to merge with Tengen. Now, it's entirely possible that Riko straight up decides not to merge with Tengen, and Geto and Gojo end up going against Jujutsu Society to save her. But this changes everything, starting with the fact that Geto doesn't get disillusioned with human society, and instead finds purpose in protecting Riko. Gojo's awakening probably still happens anyway because he's still challenged plenty of times. But now we have 2 special grade sorcerers going rogue from Jujutsu Society. This actually has a significant impact on Sukuna and Kenjaku, since if Gojo isn't involved with Jujutsu High, he won't be there when Yuji eats Sukuna's fingers for the first time. So after Yuji is captured by Jujutsu High, there's no one to set him free, and the higher-ups proceed with their plan to feed Yuji all 20 of Sukuna's fingers and execute him afterward. And this brings us to Kenjaku, because he needed Geto to die in order to take over his body. In the original timeline, it took Okotsu Yuta and Rika holding off Geto until Gojo finally arrived to end his life. But in this timeline, Gojo and Geto are actually still partners, making it nearly impossible for anyone to hurt either of them, much less kill one and take over his body. In this version of events, Toji actually doesn't even need to do anything. If Yuji remains in prison, that means Sukuna is restrained by default, and if Geto isn't killed, Kenjaku's plans get delayed indefinitely. In this timeline, our major antagonists become the cursed spirits who want to end humanity. Jogo, Mohito, these 4 spirits are unaffected by Toji's decision and still continue their agenda. But this time, they don't get to strike a deal with Kenjaku. There's also the problem of Gojo not being around to fight them off, which means that Jogo and Hanami might actually do quite a bit of damage to the forces of both the Tokyo and Kyoto branches of Jujutsu High. However, these curses simply aren't powerful enough to significantly shift the balance of the Jujutsu world, meaning that we get a long period of peace. This timeline is ideal for everyone except Yuji, as they get to live their lives in peace, but we all know that perfect endings don't exist in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. And this brings us to the second timeline, where Toji doesn't change his personality and only changes the past. Toji's trauma and his belief that he was inferior because he lacks cursed energy comes from years of torment by the Zenin clan. Just because he's reborn, it doesn't mean that all that trauma gets wiped out and he becomes a clean slate once more. So even with all his memories, he still sells Megami off to the Zenin clan because he genuinely believes that the Zenin can give Megami something he can't. He'd rather give Megami the best version of the world that rejected him than risk raising him in a dangerous household. This means Toji still becomes a deadbeat after his wife's death and still takes the Riko Amanai contract for the same reasons. But this time, the difference is that he knows exactly when to leave. You see, Toji isn't an idiot. He stuck around to fight Gojo a second time because he was confident that it would be a close fight once again. That confidence was the thing that killed him, because he couldn't possibly account for what Gojo would become on the other side of nearly dying. This time, the moment the contract is done, Toji disappears, because he knows that the new version of Gojo is a monster he can't take down unprepared. He collects nothing, leaves no trail, and vanishes into the same underworld infrastructure he spent years building. Gojo survives in this new awakened state, but he doesn't defeat Toji. In fact, he probably doesn't even try to hunt Toji down because he realizes that this was just a contract and that Toji poses no threat to the rest of Jujutsu Society. Toji Fushiguro continues taking contracts to assassinate sorcerers, but he avoids Gojo Satoru because he knows that's one opponent that's out of his league. Meanwhile, Megami joins the Zenin clan and is eventually sent to Jujutsu High to further refine his technique. The paths that Gojo and Geto take after the Riko Amanai incident remain the same as in the canon storyline, which makes for a huge change over the first timeline we explored. Kenjaku still manages to take over Geto's body, and Gojo steps in to prevent Yuji's execution, meaning that the culling game is on track to start just like it did in the canon timeline. But this raises another question. Does Toji ever step in and try to influence the events of this timeline? Technically, he would if he knew the effects of the Shibuya incident or the culling game, but the problem here is that Toji has virtually zero information about the future from this point onwards. This becomes important in the Shibuya arc, because originally, Toji was resurrected through Granny Ogame's seance technique to be used as a weapon. Toji ends up wiping out a bunch of curse users, and even defeats Takuma Ino before he begins to regain his sense of self. This reawakened version of Toji gets maybe 20 minutes of consciousness, where he defeats Dagon and rescues the sorcerers caught in the cursed spirit's domain. Now, chances are they'd still be able to escape Dagon's domain thanks to the combined efforts of Nanami, Megami, Naobito, and Maki, but this means Dagon will survive the battle and fight on. But at this point in time, Mohito's group of cursed spirits aren't that important to the timeline compared to Sukuna and Kenjaku, so the Shibuya incident plays out the same as it did in the original timeline. So Gojo gets sealed and the culling game is set in motion, but this is where things begin to change. You see, Gojo had already instructed Yuta on what to do if something ever ever happened to him, because he knew to go rescue Yuji and contact Hakari for assistance. Chances are, Gojo would tell Yuta about Toji Fushiguro, the man who nearly killed him in the past. There's a good reason why Gojo would see Toji as a potential ally, because deep down, Toji isn't an evil person. Toji genuinely cares about Megumi, and doesn't have any real malicious intent when he carries out his contracts. But most importantly, Toji is a completely independent actor with the physical capacity to threaten virtually anyone on the board. He's not bound by Jujutsu Society politics, Kinjaku's ideology, or any allegiances to an organization. Recruiting Toji for the culling game also becomes much easier when Tsumiki is involved, because now things are personal. Toji definitely doesn't care about the bigger picture of the culling game, but he'll do everything in his power to save his stepdaughter. Once Jujutsu High sorcerers figure out the mechanic that allows players to substitute themselves in place of another, Toji immediately volunteers to take Tsumiki's place. This is the most competent parroting move Toji has ever made, but if you think about it, he's the kind of person who would join a colony just for the thrill of fighting strong sorcerers as well. But there's a problem, and it's the same problem that defines this entire arc. The person walking around in Tsumiki's body isn't Tsumiki. It's Yorozu, the ancient sorcerer who used the culling game's resurrection rules to incarnate herself inside Tsumiki, and Toji has no way of knowing this until he's standing in front of her. Yorozu rejecting the offer and deciding to enter the Sendai colony directly is probably the most painful moment in either timeline for Toji, because unlike his wife's death or selling Megumi off to the Zenin, there's nothing to rationalize here. His daughter is gone, and someone else is wearing her face. Toji can't substitute himself for Yorozu because Yorozu has no interest in leaving, and he can't kill her because killing her means killing Tsumiki's body, and any chance of reversing the process. So Toji watches on as things go from bad to worse when Sukuna takes control of Megumi's body as well. This is devastating for Toji, because possession techniques aren't things that he can reverse with his fists, so he must rely on Jujutsu sorcerers to save his kids. The best Toji can do is try to stop the fight between Sukuna and Yorozu, and this is actually not such a bad idea. You see, killing Tsumiki was a critical part of Sukuna's plan to break Megumi's spirit, so if Toji manages to capture and restrain Tsumiki's body, Sukuna won't get a chance to kill her. But no one can actually stop Sukuna, because even though Toji successfully beats Yorozu, Sukuna comes searching for her regardless. This battle is twice as devastating for Megumi, as Sukuna takes on Toji as well. Toji might have a chance if he was fighting Sukuna freely, but the objective of watching Tsumiki is just too much for him. You see, Toji only ever fought to assassinate other people and has absolutely no experience fighting like a bodyguard. So while the sorcerer killer still survives his battle with the King of Curses, he simply cannot save Tsumiki's life. Now Megumi is gone, Sukuna has a new vessel, and Toji Fushiguro, a man who came back with the benefit of hindsight, couldn't do a single thing to stop it. Toji changes enough to matter in some places, but the culling game was never really about him. Kinjaku's machinery was too large and too far along, so the most Toji could do was arrive at the disaster early enough to watch it happen up close. Going into the Shinjuku showdown, Toji has no illusions about what Sukuna is. He's seen this body work before, and he knows what Megumi's 10 Shadows technique looks like when it's being used by someone who genuinely wants to kill you. In the original timeline, Gojo fought by himself against Sukuna, but you have to wonder, is Toji good enough to fight alongside the world's strongest sorcerer? Once again, Gojo would insist on fighting alone, because while he might be okay with Toji dying in battle, it would be a waste of his talents if Toji got caught in a hollow purple by mistake. So Gojo still fights Sukuna on his own, and as we know, this battle doesn't go well for the Jujutsu sorcerers. But when Yuji and Higuruma step in to keep up the pressure on Sukuna, this is when Toji can join the fight. Once you take out the question of collateral damage, Toji is super useful because he brings something that nobody else on the battlefield has, a body that registers differently to Sukuna. Every other sorcerer in this fight is radiating cursed energy, and Sukuna has spent centuries learning to read that output like a language. Toji has none, and just like Maki, we know that Sukuna is going to struggle to read the battlefield against an opponent with no cursed energy. When Higuruma opens with deadly sentencing, Toji's job is simple. He needs to be a physical problem that Sukuna cannot ignore. Once Higuruma locks Sukuna into confiscation and death penalty, Toji rushes in to create an opening for him to strike with the executioner's sword. The deadly sentencing still confiscates the Kamutoke instead of shrine, but that oversight is Higuruma's, and no amount of additional pressure from Toji changes the mechanics of how Judgman works. In the original raid, Sukuna isolates Higuruma almost immediately by separating him from the group, but with Toji in the mix, that separation is harder to execute cleanly. Higuruma still takes devastating damage, but he stays in the fight a few crucial seconds longer, and when Sukuna finally cuts him down, and the executioner's sword's cross goes sailing through the air, it's Toji who catches it first. It still doesn't land though, because Sukuna is Sukuna. But this matters for what comes after, because Toji is still standing when Yuta arrives with Rika, and that changes the shape of the fight entirely. He can't enter authentic mutual love as a meaningful combatant as he has no cursed energy to contribute, and no way to help with the soul work that domain is built around. But he can hold the outside perimeter with Maki and the others, making sure that Sukuna doesn't get clean breathing room between phases. Toji will never be the one who finishes Sukuna, but he is the reason several people survive long enough to matter. And for a man who spent most of his life being told he had nothing to offer the world of Jujutsu, that's a different kind of victory. But what do you think? Could Toji have made a bigger difference in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.